Good evening. My name is Erika Schmidt, and I am the president of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to our first virtual alumni event. This virtual format enables us to reach many of you who would not have been able to attend an on-site, in-person event. It's one of the serendipitous outcomes of this very challenging pandemic year. Our alumni group includes many people from many backgrounds. It includes graduates of our adult psychotherapy program, our child and adolescent psychotherapy program, and our psychoanalytic education program. Some of us, like me, are graduates of more than one program. I began my education at this institute in the CAPT program just as soon as I had the required 2 years postgraduate clinical experience. This was in the days before social workers were admitted to analytic training and the days before there was an adult psychotherapy program. It is an understatement to say that what I learned in the CAPT program has shaped my career and my thinking as a therapist and analyst ever since. Let me briefly mention two of the most important things I learned. First, I learned how to listen. Listening in depth is a fundamental skill and basic to our empathic capacities. It means listening to what people say, listening to what people do, and listening to the communication beneath the words and the actions. It is how we can reach the feelings and thoughts that motivate people to do what they do and to feel how they feel. And it allows us to enter into the world of their subjectivity. These listening skills extend outward, and that brings me to my second point, that psychoanalysis is relevant everywhere because psychoanalysis is about people, about why people think the way they do, why they feel the way they feel, and what they do with those thoughts and feelings. It informs us in our practices, but also in our professional activities in the wider world, whether as consultant, teacher, advisor, committee member, organizational consultant, or group leader. And it helps us in all the contexts in which we live, work, and play, helps us appreciate the ways in which emotions, relationships, and unconscious motivation are part of what happens in all these realms. We'll hear more about this evening from Alexander Stein. You, as our graduates, help extend the reach of psychoanalysis into so many areas. Thank you for being here this evening. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, someone familiar to many of you, Dr. James Fisch. Jim graduated from the Institute's Psychoanalytic Training Program after he finished his residency in psychiatry at Michael Reese Hospital. He has been in private practice for 50 years now. For 18 years, he was director of the adult psychotherapy program, and I think it is fair to say that he is largely responsible for the excellent reputation it has in our community. Welcome, Dr. Jim Fisch.
Thank you, Erika, for that introduction. Good evening, my fellow alumni. Welcome to this very special event for graduates of the psychoanalytic education programs at the Institute. I started my courses at the Institute in 1970, and I finished sometime around the end of the 70s or perhaps the beginning of the 80s. I'm not exactly sure, because in those days, we were sure when we began, but we were never exactly sure when we ended. In many ways, we felt that if you got your certificate from the Institute, before you got your certificate from Medicare, you could think of yourself as a whiz kid. Now, who were we and where did we come from? First of all, we were all men. And with a very, very rare exception, there was an occasional female analyst also studying in our classes. And we were all doctors, every one of us. We all graduated from psychiatric residencies, and most of us, especially in my class, we were a class of 13, most of us came from Michael Reese. If you started your residency at Michael Reese, whether you knew it or not, you were going to get into analysis and you were going to go and study at the Analytic Institute. And most of us did. In addition, we had a few candidates from other cities. We were a geographic center in those days. So we had candidates from Boulder and Denver, and we had some candidates from St. Louis. The classes in those days took place every other weekend. It was all day Friday and half a day Saturday. And the people from the other cities, they flew in twice a month. They spent those weekends in Chicago, flew back. After about 90 trips like that, poof, they were analysts. So it was a very different scene in those days. Today, I think we have a very different institute. For one thing, we have many, many certificate programs. We have people studying who are scholars. We have people studying who are learning the fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. We have psychotherapy programs. We have many, many programs, and we have people from all over the world. Not only do we have students from Chicago, but we have students even from other cities in America. And then we have all those students from China and from other countries. I understand that there's over 150 students studying at the Institute today at any one time, which is quite amazing. So it used to be that the Institute was the only game in town. It's not the only game in town today, but it's without a doubt the most innovative and the most dynamic. So now I would like to introduce Tim Sawyier, who is currently a candidate in the PE program, and he'll give you some idea of what things are like today.
Thank you, Dr. Fisch, for those reflections and reminiscences. My name is Tim Sawyier. I'm a third-year candidate in the Institute's Psychoanalytic Education program and also a graduate of the Adult Psychotherapy Fellowship at the Institute's Treatment Center. Psychoanalysis is a second career for me. Before becoming a clinician, I was a professional oboist. I studied at Philadelphia's Curtis Institute of Music, spent summers at Aspen and Tanglewood, and performed professionally with ensembles in and around Chicago for a number of years, before ultimately deciding to exchange my seat in the orchestra for one behind the analytic couch. While that story is one for another time, having been seriously involved in classical music and now in psychoanalysis means that I've had the strange experience of being a young person avidly pursuing not one, but two fields that are popularly believed to be dying. To paraphrase Mark Twain, I'm pleased to report that, in both cases, reports of such deaths have been greatly exaggerated. Psychoanalysis is alive, well, and even experiencing a renaissance, but there were reasons in the past to believe rumors of its demise. Those outside the analytic ivory tower could think of it, and not entirely unfairly, as a musty, esoteric exercise for the upper middle class, irrelevant, if not in fact threatening, to the experience of the vast majority of people. Psychoanalysis came by that reputation honestly, and a major trend in the discipline's recent history has been its attempts to respond to these criticisms by updating and adapting itself to present-day realities. So in what has this adaptation consisted, particularly at the Chicago Institute? For starters, someone like me can be a part of it. As a gay person with a non-medical background, I would not have been permitted to train as an analyst until relatively recently in psychoanalytic history, at least in this country. The fact of my speaking to you now as a candidate represents some of the significant changes psychoanalysis has undergone in its recent decades, which the Institute has embraced. While a core of the candidate's experience remains learning from esteemed faculty, the best of whom, in my opinion, honor psychoanalytic traditions while also acknowledging the field's lapses, the Institute's greater openness also allows for the opportunity to learn from colleagues with a wide array of different backgrounds and educational trajectories. So what does the future hold? I felt that I got a taste of this when earlier this year I presented an ongoing analytic case to the second-year candidates who are working hard to establish analytic patients of their own. the feedback I received from these classmates was invaluable, in large part because of the plurality of perspectives represented in the class. While the instructor, a psychologist, was able to provide a solid grounding in analytic theory, among the class were a child therapist, a professor of epistemology, an individual with a particular interest in linguistics, and a number of clinicians from China. Predictably enough, there was a significant overlap between my perspective on the case and my supervisors, and contributions from these classmates, steeped as they were in different cultural surrounds, knowledge bases, and life experiences, broadened my own understanding and have remained important to my ongoing work with the patient. Psychoanalysis undeniably faces significant challenges in our day, but I hope I'm not being Pollyannish when I say that the future holds its continued expansion to related disciplines and to greater numbers of interested people. In terms of psychoanalytic study, there are more ways for more people to become involved in analysis through the Institute than there have ever been, particularly through the year-long fundamentals curriculum, the free Exploring Psychoanalysis program, and the fellowship programs through the Institute's clinics. Clinic fellows, who are recent graduates of clinical programs, exchange their time for supervision and training, gaining invaluable clinical experience themselves while making psychoanalytic therapy an accessible proposition for those who might not otherwise have access to it. It is imperative that training and treatment continue to be made accessible to an ever wider array of individuals, and the Institute is making sure this remains the case. In that sense, the future may already be here. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Institute's Dean, Dr. Wendy Selene.
Thank you, alumni of our Institute, for joining us this evening at this event in your honor. We appreciate all you do for the Institute and the ways in which you bring psychoanalysis into the world. Many of us hold the belief that psychoanalysis is hard to explain to others who are not in this field. How do we describe the importance of unconscious forces that play a role in people's current behaviors, thoughts, and emotions? Tonight, we have the good fortune to have as our speaker Dr. Alexander Stein, someone who has successfully shared the importance of psychoanalytic principles and psychoanalytic thought in corner offices, boardrooms, with corporate leaders, lawyers, investigators, among others. His talk this evening is entitled Psychoanalysis in the Public Sphere, A Call to Action. A recent paper on this topic that he wrote for Psychoanalytic Perspectives was described as half battle cry for and half love letter to psychoanalysis. We hope you will find his talk tonight not only interesting, but inspiring. Dr. Alexander Stein serves as a confidential advisor to CEOs, senior management teams, and boards. He advises business leaders in issues involving leadership, culture, ethical governance, risk, and other aspects of organizational life with complex psychological underpinnings. He is a principal in the Boswell Group, a psychodynamic management consulting firm, and founder of Dolus Advisors, a consultancy that helps organizations detect, mitigate, and resolve problems of human misbehavior, such as fraud, corruption, executive misconduct, insider threats, and human vulnerabilities in cybersecurity, and develop more psychologically accurate and sophisticated human technology systems. Alexander is widely published and cited in the business press. He's a former monthly columnist for Fortune Small Business magazine, and currently a contributor to Forbes writing on the psychology of leadership and misbehavior in business. He is a frequent keynote speaker and panelist at conferences internationally. Alexander is a graduate and member of the National Psychological Association for Psychoanalysis in New York, and has published extensively in many of the preeminent psychoanalytic journals. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Alexander Stein.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to join you tonight. I hope all of you are safe and well. It'd certainly be great to actually be in Chicago together, but hats off to everyone at CPI, the Hoopla team, and Roustabout Media for making this event happen despite the pandemic. In a conversation with Preet Bharara, former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York and now host of the Stay Tuned with Preet podcast, Susan Hennessy, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and executive editor of the Lawfare blog, said, "Imagine you learn the story of your favorite novel through completely accurate, unbiased news, headlines about it. Man hunts whale, boat sinks. The major plot points laid out for you. Even if it was completely fair reporting on the story, you wouldn't get to the end and say, 'I understand what the book is about.' Similarly, what I'm going to share in our 20 minutes together are only some headlines about more expansive uses of psychoanalysis. I hope when I'm done, you won't feel that it got late early and that you'll be stimulated to learn more." In 1926, Freud asserted that clinical analytic practice might not be the limit of, or even the most important use for, psychoanalysis. Nearly a century later, that's apparently still a provocative statement. But my career as a psychoanalyst working as a business advisor and specialist consultant, along with many others who deliver psychoanalytic expertise in a variety of non-clinical contexts, are emblematic of what Freud envisioned. That's my message in a nutshell. Psychoanalysts can do more in the world beyond providing patient treatment. The evolution and trajectory of my experience is the point of entry, but this talk is about psychoanalysis, not me. It's about recognizing psychoanalysis as arguably the most powerful tool on the planet for understanding and explaining the human condition, and, even more importantly, seeing how it can be more broadly and robustly leveraged in the world beyond treating patients. My psychoanalytic journey began in 1996 when I made the decision to pivot from my earlier career as a professional musician. I stepped off the concert stage, enrolled in grad school, and started analytic training. My aim was to be a traditional scholar clinician, and I was dedicated to that pursuit. I started building a private practice, and even while still a candidate, was already publishing in psychoanalytic journals and speaking at international conferences. Becoming a more knowledgeable, attuned, and skillful analyst, treating patients and participating in and contributing to the psychoanalytic community felt deeply fulfilling and important to me. And yet, I couldn't dismiss certain misgivings. One was experiencing our profession be derided as anachronistic, impractical, and irrelevant. The analytic establishment's essential acquiescence to that marginalization and reputational battering was, and remains, confounding and distressing. Then, September 11th, 2001, my wife and I lived across the street from the World Trade Center towers and were pregnant with our first child. We lost our home that day. Thankfully, our losses were only material. But once we eventually resettled and had given birth to our son, I emerged with a different perspective on the world and a reclarified professional purpose. Gone was any tolerance for the petty conflicts of psychoanalytic tribalism, the rivalrous jousting between institutes and practice modalities, the toothless non-defense against broadside attacks of psychoanalytic efficacy, and the overall failure of the profession to more clearly and effectively communicate what psychoanalysts know and do to broader constituents. I was powerfully motivated to exercise greater impact. I decided to take what I knew and been trained to do and step outside the traditional private practice model. I repositioned myself as a psychoanalytic, activist entrepreneur to deploy rather than practice psychoanalysis, to use psychoanalytic expertise with leaders of organizations, people in positions of authority, responsibility, and influence, in situations where the consequences of decisions and behavior are amplified. Today, I had my own boutique consulting firm, Dolus Advisors, advising business leaders and boards in a range of organizational issues involving complex psychological underpinnings. I'm also a principal in the Boswell Group, comprised of psychiatrists and psychoanalysts who consult to organizations, founded by my friend and colleague Carrie Sulkowitz, the president-elect of the American Psychoanalytic Association. All of my consulting work and writing is premised on the understanding that there is no such thing as an enterprise, which is not a human ecosystem. There is no facet of corporate or organizational life which is not governed and influenced by powerful psychological forces. People, the human element, are at the center of every professional situation. To effectively convey the value of my core deliverable in the marketplace, I distilled the salient essence of psychoanalytic competency and therapeutic action into 6 words: expertise in human behavior and decision-making. There's no shortage of cognitive psychology, pop psychology, behavioral economics, and social science shaping public notions of human motivation and behavior. Certainly, not all of it is spurious. Some of it is incisive and useful. But most of it gets diluted, compressed, and translated into quantified data and psychology-light talking points for general consumption. And the vast majority of what's presented to and ingested by the business world and the general public veers between psychologically naive and psychologically illiterate. Reductionism, oversimplification, anti-complexity, and pseudo-solutions are ever present. But business leaders, technologists, and other professionals are not gulping all that pablum because they're undiscriminating or disinterested in anything better. Executives have industrial-sized responsibilities and requirements on their plates every day. Most don't have, or don't think they can allocate, the bandwidth or patience to deeply explore and understand the massive complexity of human psychology. What's offered by management consultants and in business magazines regarding human thought and behavior appears to provide credible answers and practical, executable solutions. In a world in which the value of something is measured as the value it is capable of yielding, it actually almost makes sense that psychometric tests and formulaic cognitive explanations of direct causal links between thought and action would be prized. And yet, there's a strong desire to know more and understand more, and to be provided with more sophisticated insight and expertise. In my view, this presents enormous opportunity. Every aspect of human affairs, from legitimate business and technology to the shadowy world of nefarious dealings, involves, is impacted by, and is an expression of the human condition as psychoanalysts understand it and about which psychoanalysis can provide material assistance. Against that backdrop, I've been continually expanding and refining my array of practice areas. My portfolio of engagements is always shifting. That's the nature of consulting. One constant is my work with leaders. Sometimes it's the CEO alone, but more typically involves the entire executive team and often the board chair and the board of directors as well. But my focus is on the principal decision-making authorities, not roles and titles in a structure. And irrespective of the number of individuals I'm regularly meeting with, 1, 5, or 25, the organization is my client, not a single person. A granular foray into key differences between clinical psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic business consulting needs to wait. Suffice it to say now that a psychoanalytic approach to leaders and leadership is different from the formulaic behavioral coaching provided by conventional management consultants. Simply put, close attention is given to the leader as a complex person, not just as a role and function, and to leadership capacities, strengths, and weaknesses as a convoluted developmental process shaped by early and contemporary life experience and context, not just a defined set of hard skills to be learned and practiced. Other practice areas have evolved through a combination of clear-eyed business development strategy, entrepreneurial opportunism, and serendipity. I entered the fraud and corruption space, for instance, unexpectedly. In early 2010, I got an email from one of the world's preeminent fraud and corruption litigators, a founding member of FraudNet, which is an elite international consortium of fraud and asset recovery lawyers. He'd been following my columns on the psychology of leadership in Fortune. When we spoke, he told me he'd come to realize that he and his colleagues, all top experts in their field, were functioning as amateur psychologists, and that their lack of expertise was a handicap. He invited me to assist. I instantly said yes, though I actually had no idea at first how I'd follow through and actually help, and it took me several months to cohere my initial framework, methodology, and deliverables. But that began my involvement as an embedded specialist in multidisciplinary teams in large value, multi-jurisdictional fraud, corruption, and kleptocracy cases to help bring fraudsters and other corrupt actors to justice, dismantle nefarious organizations, and recover victims' losses. That work continues to this day and remains important to me in large part because there's a significant social justice component. But asset recovery cases are slow-moving, and by definition organized around redressing wrongs already committed. Looking to expand my reach, I recognized additional growth opportunities in prevention and defense. According to a recent Association of Certified Fraud Examiners report, organizations lose 5% of annual revenue to fraud, causing total global losses of nearly $3.6 billion. There is no business that isn't interested in better protecting itself and reducing its contribution to that number. I decided to develop offerings to help organizational leaders proactively mitigate misconduct risks and implement psychologically sophisticated defenses against white-collar and organizational malfeasance. Those professional experiences, in turn, introduced me to the cybersecurity space, where malicious incident risks are typically considered technology problems to be solved technically, and the human element is generally treated simplistically. Many engagements in this area involve partnering with enterprise leaders and information security, risk, and technology professionals, and even other consultants to develop less mechanistic and more psychosocially sophisticated methods for understanding, diagnosing, and addressing cybersecurity issues, for instance, social engineering tactics and vulnerabilities, and to guide organizations through behavior and decision-making changes to instill a more cybersecure mindset and culture. Another important aspect of my professional life is writing and speaking. The writing I started while still a candidate in training has never stopped, though I eventually migrated from publishing long-form essays about clinical and theoretical issues in analytic journals to writing in a jargon-free, accessible way, simply, but not simplistically, as I put it, for business magazines and other industry publications. I do podcasts, increasingly more on-camera appearances, and present at industry conferences and corporate events. In all of these activities, I'm always the only psychoanalyst, and invariably the only person talking who has expertise outside the subject area of the event. In this respect, I consider myself an evangelist, or at the least an ambassador, of psychoanalytic thinking perspectives and principles. It's a part of my professional mission to help more broadly and accurately communicate what psychoanalysts can do, and as a bonus, debunk some stereotypes and caricatures along the way. There are certainly many other ways to deliver psychoanalysis into the broader world. Consider the IPA's podcast, On and Off the Couch, hosted by Drs. Harvey Schwartz and my Boswell Group colleague, Stephen Rolfe. Their guests represent a catalog of psychoanalysts who work in hospitals, clinics, community centers, schools, prisons, humanitarian organizations, and myriad other venues. There are analysts of color and others who bring their life experience, analytic expertise, and powerful voices to redress the prejudicial marginalization of individuals and communities and create transformative social change. There are established public intellectuals and activist researchers whose psychoanalytically informed ideas are regularly in the media. This is but a small sampling of important and often courageous non-clinical analytic work going on all around us. My work covers a diverse spectrum of areas. You can think of it as a higher octane or industrial strength psychoanalysis. To traditionalists and old guard custodians of a pure psychoanalytic orthodoxy, what I do is wrong-headed, a heresy, a perversion, maybe just bad psychoanalysis. I've heard it all, including unrestrained invective about how I'd benefit from another and hopefully better second analysis, so that I'd work out whatever unaddressed pathology drives me to act out in this unseemly way, come to my senses, and return to private practice where good psychoanalysts belong. There's a lot I could say about all of that. But the better response is just to explain how I think and speak psychoanalytically in corner offices and boardrooms, with technologists and data scientists, with lawyers and investigators, and when collaborating with consultants and other professionals who provide similar sounding services, advising corporate leaders, addressing organizational culture, developing cybersecurity programs, mitigating corporate risk, fighting fraud and corruption, but whose work, because it isn't informed by psychoanalytic thinking or clinical experience, is very different from mine. But to paraphrase Blaise Pascal, if I had more time, I would have given a longer talk. Instead, in the time remaining, I want to say something about the larger project of revitalizing psychoanalysis. Applied psychoanalysis as a concept and a term needs to be sent to the glue factory. Many of you may have been thinking as I've been talking that what I do sounds like a kind of applied analysis. I understand, seems to make sense. But applied psychoanalysis is more than a term of art designating the paraclinical use of analytic principles in non- and extraclinical settings. It encodes a pernicious classism. It refers to a caste system which has been perpetuated to preserve a hierarchical status quo. Proper psychoanalysis, which by default means clinical practice, and applied, a lesser offshoot. It promotes a defensive, anxiety-driven conservatism, which limits and inhibits progressive and agile decision-making across the profession. The concept is a relic, a regressive attitude which is divisive, exclusionary, and ideologically antithetical to the values and principles psychoanalysts profess to embody and promote. The attitudes implicit in the phrase and its history, from which we have yet to disentangle ourselves, have indirectly contributed to sidelining and hamstringing psychoanalysis. In universities, undergrads interested in psychoanalysis won't take psychology classes, but will have to study literary critical theory. Psychoanalysis has never established footholds as a standalone department in teaching hospitals, universities, or research centers, curtailing the cultivation of talented, ambitious disciples who could pursue research, apprenticeships, or have impact across business and society. Psychoanalytic thought and work have become eclipsed by empirical research in cognitive and behavioral psychology and neuroscience. Its influence is circumscribed and its functionality questioned. Applied psychoanalysis, along with the idea of the lay analyst, which likewise needs to be banished and entombed, continues to cast a shadow, if not a stain, on psychoanalysis's reputation. With what authority can analysts hope to speak to issues of social inequality and discrimination, or position itself as relevant and useful for addressing any number of issues people face in contemporary society, when our field still preserves its own antediluvian attitudes? What can be done? How can we reverse the adverse effects of decades of reputational hammering and market decline and reassert our field as relevant and useful? And to many, not just an elite few, and in various important areas of society and human affairs, not just to treat a limited population of patients who are motivated and able to commit to treatment. There are no easy answers. One, however, I suggest, will require a penetrating industry-wide self-analysis, from nose to tail, training institutes, national and international organizations and societies, conferences, journals. We must soberly assess and change our field's insularity, passivity, self-abnegation, and impulse to disengagement from the world. Dropping two phrases would be a tiny gesture in the scheme of things. It fixes nothing in itself. But every turnaround needs us to start someplace. It'd be one modest but meaningful step toward updating how we regard ourselves and message an important shift in our posture in the world. Another, more crucially, is at the heart of psychoanalysis's core strength: understanding the root causes of human problems and developing deep, incisive, and durable solutions. Psychoanalysis can and should be used in more muscular, actionable, and outward-facing ways. It can and should be brought to bear as a force for positive change and influence on a larger scale, in addition to being a peerless treatment method to help patients. It can and should be more effectively leveraged as a powerful and unparalleled tool, still woefully underutilized, but much needed in today's complex world.
Alexander, thank you for your stimulating and informative discussion of how we can bring psychoanalysis into the public sphere. I'd like to take this time to ask you a few questions. First, this evening you referred to a call to action. Could you say more about what you mean by this? What qualities or elements of actions are you calling for? And could you offer some inspiration and encouragement for those of us who would like to brave expressing ourselves in the public sphere?
Well, thank you so much, Wendy. It's really been a pleasure. So I was reading an article one day in Fortune that focused on pyromaniacal leaders, basically leaders who were very destructive to their organizations. And there was a lead business management guru who was cited a lot in that article as really the oracle of everything. And I was aghast, actually, as I was reading by the paucity of knowledge and the unlikelihood of his solutions to succeed. And so I decided there and then that I would write a letter to the editor explaining some alternative perspectives and what I thought would be better solutions to the problem that was discussed in the article. And fairly promptly got a response back that they wanted to publish my letter. And as I was speaking with the associate editor of the magazine about making some edits so that the piece would fit into the available real estate, I just sensed that there was an interest in what I was saying. And so I suggested that perhaps they would like to hear more from me. And shortly thereafter, I had a regular column, at first online and then in print, writing about the psychology of entrepreneurship and leadership. For analysts to think about the real difference between therapeutic action and action. Therapeutic action is, of course, enormously important in generating change in patients, and we have to be able to attend to their inner lives and understand fantasy and symbolism and subjective experience. And that's the special sauce of psychoanalysis. But we're also unique as a profession in often peripheralizing or even ignoring crises that occur in the real world, and that we don't necessarily have to be first responders into those issues, but we do need to recognize that there is an external world. The entire universe of issues is not just fantasy or symbol. And so as we use love and care and attunement and close listening, we also need to use other tools, and we need to be able to step forward and be more energetically engaged with other aspects of the world. And the last thing, since you used the word bravery, is there's an old New Yorker cartoon of an elephant sitting at a concert grand piano on the stage of Carnegie Hall. And the caption is the elephant's inner thought. And it says, "What am I doing here? I play the flute." Right? So different things intimidate different people. And as analysts, we all understand that there are various forms of, social or performance anxiety that's usually different from the activity or the situation itself. In meetings every day, I'm surrounded by people who know a lot more than I do about a lot of things. I also know that I know a lot about why people think and act the way they do, or why they don't think and act the way people expect them to. And a central feature of my work is speaking truth to power. And far from it taking courage, I consider it really a privilege and a responsibility to be of assistance to helping people who are in positions of influence, responsibility, and authority to be able to better understand themselves and to be able to better manage themselves. And so what I would say is that I encourage every analyst, whatever your comfort zone is, to own your expertise and to not get pushed back because there are many people out in the world who don't get it or who don't understand why it matters, because it really does.
A major portion of your work at this time is in the area of corporate malfeasance of the highest magnitude, bringing your expertise to schemes entailing the loss of billions of dollars. We see versions of these characters in our consulting rooms. And with your in-depth knowledge, what can you share with us about the mind of the fraudster and also the bias against victims of these crimes?
I was first approached to begin trying to assist, as I talked about in my talk, fraud fighting professionals, asset recovery professionals. And one of the first tasks there was to begin to consider what their limitations were, what they were struggling to understand. In other words, why did they ask for my help? And so I started to think about what is fraud, deception, manipulation, breaches of trust, the very definition of fraud, from a psychoanalytic perspective. And so as an analyst, my opening gambit really is that it's a normative thing, in a sense, not pathologic. And so when I started doing my work and started presenting at fraud conferences and interacting with all of these professionals, I led with the idea that everyone is a fraudster, which was something of a hand grenade for all of these professionals who pride themselves on their integrity and as champions of the rule of law. But it was crucial, I thought, to level set and help everyone understand that we're dealing with dynamic relationships where defending against the idea that we could be like the bad guys is really unhelpful, and to begin to shine a light on some of the other factors and the other motivations that are at play besides greed and pure financial gain. I also needed to work, in a sense, against some of the established frameworks for thinking. There was an idea that was put forth in the 1950s called the fraud triangle, the triangle being opportunity, rationalization, and pressure. And that was devised as a way of explaining the factors that were needed for an ordinary person to commit fraud. That basically, if you had at least one or all of those things, anybody could commit fraud. My first step was to look at what I considered to be a spherical framework of constituencies and of interdependencies among different groups. So you have the fraudster and his organization and his web of affiliates and enablers and shills. You have the victims who are traumatized and humiliated, but they're also material witnesses and stakeholders. They're not just gullible patsies. You have the asset recovery team and all of the fraud fighting professionals. And then there are judicial officers and legislative bodies and government and regulatory agencies who, depending on their position, are actually allies of justice and victims' rights, or their opponents who somehow allow the legal wrongdoing. So that's sort of one whole realm of work. And I did a lot of cases in Brazil where fraud and corruption is basically part of the national economy, unfortunately. And then, as I talked about in my talk, started to branch out into organizational malfeasance, which is treated, in a sense, quite differently because you're looking at leadership structures and institutional culture and the life cycle of a crisis. As I start to look at it, you have before, during, and after. And I often say to clients that I can come in with a whiteboard or a mop and a pail, which basically means before or after the poop hits the fan. And by and large, corporations like to keep things neat and tidy and to look at these issues quite mechanistically. So behavior is supposed to be something that you can control. And organizations are often blindsided by insider malfeasance, not because they weren't thinking about it, but because they don't understand all of the micro ways that it can create situations.
If we think monstrous acts are only committed by monsters, then we distance ourselves from a piece of ourselves as well, which we always want to pay attention to in psychoanalysis. In the time we have left, I'm wondering if you could tell us something more about other areas in the corporate world to which you bring psychoanalytic principles, and particularly how you interface with those whose interests are very different from psychoanalysts.
Let me describe a very interesting project I was involved in in cybersecurity. So I was engaged by the CISO, which is the Chief Information Security Officer of a national organization which has 10,000 employees. And I was tasked to help design and implement what they considered a next generation awareness training program. So awareness training is a typical way that organizations attempt to get their workforce to understand the do's and don'ts of cybersecurity policy and procedure, and to teach cyber safety, how not to fall victim to social engineering flaws like phishing or other scams. My role in the project was designated as Chief Human Factor Architect, which tasked me with developing new approaches and solutions for cybersecurity awareness education and training, and to strengthen their human layer of security. I was not there, obviously, as a technologist, but really to help them understand how to bolster the human factor. It was a huge multi-part project, and there won't be time for a really deep dive, but what I want to highlight is this. So I was collaborating with teams of organizational change management and cybersecurity specialists from one of the large global consulting firms, along with the CISO and his senior colleagues in the organization. So it was quite a unique situation for me, even though I've worked in multidisciplinary teams in the fraud space and in other work. This was actually working side by side with other consultants who do similar-ish work, but who approach it in quite a different way. And I was positioned as the lead specialist. So even though the other consultants work for a multinational, multi-million dollar organization, I was actually in charge. And bringing to bear my perspectives as a psychoanalyst, one of the first things I did was to break apart behavior and awareness, and to focus on the multitudes of different issues that come together in organizations that could fortify or degrade decision-making under duress, and to help people become more engaged in learning and wanting to change rather than just complying with safety policies. So I help them create learning modules and scenario simulations in which I built in enormous psychological complexity to the curriculum, for example, requiring that people self-reflect on decisions that they were making, including what they were thinking and feeling in crux moments, not just assessing them for being correct or not, which is how conventional training is done, designed to enable greater actual self-awareness, which is different from situational awareness, which is usually what's focused on in awareness training, and helping people to think about the connections between thought and action, or the effects of being distracted, or understanding their baseline responses when they're comfortable and safe versus when they're pressured or frightened, which is what happens in stressor moments during social engineering attacks. And it was an incredibly fascinating situation. I learned a lot. The client was really satisfied. The CISO and I have gone on to co-present our collaboration in that work at cybersecurity conferences, which is really a fascinating situation. It's actually quite rare for a psychoanalyst and an information security officer to partner in that way at cybersecurity conferences and in the workplace. And so I consider that kind of a shining example of bringing the work that we all do as analysts out into the world to great effect in a very different way. There was nothing about it, in a sense, that looked or sounded like psychoanalytic practice, but everything that I did was completely informed by everything I know as a psychoanalyst.
And one would hope even that the work on self-reflection would have ancillary personal benefits as well.
Mm-hmm.
The ways in which psychoanalysis can be effective outside the consulting room is really gaining attention. And to that end, we're including it as a new course in our curriculum revision called Psychoanalysis in the Larger World. And we appreciate it very much, Alexander, that you've graciously agreed to be a resource for us.
It would be my great pleasure.
And if there's enough interest, it may be that we can also think about a course for our newly revised 5th year, which will be open to our alumni. So, Alexander Stein, thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy.
Now we're at the end of this first virtual alumni event, so I'd like to thank Jim Fisch, Tim Sawyier, Wendy, Selene, and Alexander Stein for making this such a rich evening. Before we say goodnight, I have a request of you. For those of you who are able, we invite you to help support our mission by making a gift to the Institute. All gifts that are received this evening will be used to fund student scholarships, so many more can take advantage of our education programs. They can join our tradition of transforming lives and bringing psychoanalysis to the wider world. To make a gift, just click the link on the platform or in the chat. And now it is time to say goodnight and to thank you once again for being such an important part of our larger psychoanalytic community.